And then talk to me about cross-bedding.
Yeah, so cross-bedding is basically dune bedding. If you imagine sand that's being deposited by a powerful water current, it typically is deposited once you reach a certain sort of critical velocity. It starts to build up into dunes, and sand is transported up the back of the dune, and then it avalanches down the front face of the dune, the downstream side of the dune, and it builds up and forms a kind of inclined layering at the front of the dune. So as the dune migrates, it builds up this sort of inclined layering that we call cross-bedding.
Okay. The inclined
and again,
layering,
that's,
so you get actual in the rock layers noticeable
yes,
layers that you can differentiate one between the other?
Yes, okay. Exactly. So, yeah. And this, again, is very common. Cross-bedding is a very common sedimentary structure that you see in sandstones.
Okay.
And, again, it testifies to deposition of sand under conditions where you've got an abundant supply of sand and powerful water currents that are transporting that sand and depositing it as dunes.
So how does that... go ahead. Explain to me how that is used as evidence of catastrophic formation.
Well, we know from laboratory experiments where we've been able to study the hydrodynamic conditions under which sediments are deposited that sediments start off, if you have a very modest current passing over a sediment surface, at first the sediment won't be moved, it will be deposited in flat beds, plain beds, and then as the velocity increases a bit further, it begins to form ripples, and then as the velocity increases still further, it begins to then build those ripples up into larger structures called dunes.
Okay.
And then eventually, if you get to even higher water velocities, you actually lose the dune structures again, and then the sediment goes back to being deposited in flat beds, in plain beds.
Okay.
So we actually have some insights from not only from observations in nature, but also studying deposition of sediments in flumes in laboratories. We can get some insights into the kinds of hydrodynamic conditions that are required to deposit these kinds of layers. So,
and your assertion would be that the dunes happen at a certain fast enough velocity that these dunes would have to have been formed with water moving.
The deposition rate
thing, or fast velocity, which would not have happened in your typical oceanic setting. That isn't a catastrophic movement.
The deposition rate has to be relatively rapid. Now, you can form cross-bedding in settings today. Where you have rapid deposition today.
Yeah.
You can form cross-bedding in the oceans. We have large sand dunes on the floor of the North Sea, for example, which have internal cross-bedding. Mm-hmm. You can form cross-beds in fast-flowing rivers. So you can do it, but what you need is fast-flowing water and an abundant supply of sand. And what we often see in the fossil record is you get these cross-bedded formations that cover vast areas. So we're talking about.
Where we want to go to is the argument then that you find it so over such a large period of space that it's an argument for massive amounts of water moving fast over large amounts of space. Is that the argument?
Yeah. So, for example, the Coconino sandstone in Grand Canyon, it's a Permian rock unit, and it's typically cross-bedded.
Okay.
And it's an extremely widespread Permian sandstone. You find it right across northern and central Arizona, and then there are similar equivalent sandstones that you find in other states that are also of broadly similar age. So these are extremely widespread rock units. Yeah. Okay.
Is there something beyond just the wideness of cross-bedding? Is there something particular to that heading? I don't remember exactly what you wrote in that section.
So basically, it's just that combination of high velocity water flows, abundant sediment supply over very, very broad areas of the continents. And remember, of course, that when we look at these rock formations like the Coconino Sandstone, we are talking about units which are on the continents. They're not in the ocean basins. They testify to a time when there were high velocity water flows across the continents.
Right.
So that's basically the argument there. And they're not the only example, of course, of very widespread rock units. So as we kind of look through the geological record, we see widespread rock units unparalleled in the modern world. So another example, very different from the cross-bedded sandstones we've been talking about, but think of the coal deposits. So coal is made of fossilized plant material, and the thick, sequences of coal-bearing strata that we find in the Carboniferous. We find them obviously in the coal basins of North America, Illinois and Pennsylvania, places like that. We see extremely similar coal-bearing sequences here in Britain and across much of continental Europe, and they extend right out to the Ukraine. So you have this massive depositional unit that the Carboniferous coal measures, and it's of vast extent. And we don't see any equivalents of this kind of sedimentation across the continents today. Another example would be the chalk.
Like sticking with the coal.
Yeah.
Is your argument that you would only have had those coal beds being formed in an environment that is very different from today, in a catastrophic environment of rapid sedimentation and coalification?
Coalification, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So sure. So the environment in which the coal is being deposited is very different from anything that we see on the Earth today. So the conventional view is that these coals were deposited in extensive swamps lying close to sea level, periodically inundated by marine waters. And this is how you get the burial of you get the accumulation of the peat in the swamp, and then you get it buried by other sediments that are coming and being washed in, and you build up these sequences. But there is evidence that the coal is actually transported. That it's not a swamp deposit. It's not, the coal is not produced by plants being buried where they were growing, but rather the plants were being transported before burial.
What type of evidence is that?
So, for example, we have evidence of sorting of plant parts. We have evidence of
sorting in the sense that this is the type of sorting that would have occurred if it was carried along with rapid moving water, and that wouldn't have happened if it was buried in place where it was actually growing.
Exactly.
In
so
the same way that rocks
the plants are
in water might sort out from heaviest to lightest, from going from bottom to top.
That's exactly it. So the plant parts are often sorted by water transport. If you look at the texture of the coals, and you compare them to the texture of peat in modern peat swamps, the texture is very different. So the texture of peat in modern peat swamps is typically a kind of very fine-grained, homogeneous texture, because it's intensely penetrated by the roots of the plants that were growing there. So it has this kind of coffee grain sort of texture. Whereas if you actually look at the ancient Carboniferous coals, they often have a very sheet-like layered appearance. That they appear to have been formed, for example, by sheets of bark that have come off trees and been buried as large sheets of bark. So it's just got a different texture. You also find curious things. Occasionally, marine fossils have been found within coal seams. Occasionally, exotic boulders have been found, which have clearly been transported some distance from somewhere else. You can match them up to a distant source. So there are lots of evidences that the coals have been transported into place.
Which
We have
would
evidences.
be evidence against the conventional view.
Yes.
And for
yes.
the catastrophic view.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well,
and there are many other examples, like that we could think about. These extensive, catastrophically deposited sedimentary units.
Can you, without explaining them, for someone who wants to do a Google search so that they have keywords, can you cover a number of those? Just mention them by name before we move on to the radiometric dating of rocks.
Well, instead of a Google search, a good place to look would actually be in Derek Ager's book. I mentioned earlier that book, the Nature of the Stratigraphical Record, and I think it's his chapter 1 is about specifically this phenomenon of extremely widespread sedimentary units.
Okay.
And he goes right through the geological column and gives multiple examples right the way through the rock record. And if people are sort of interested to follow up some examples, he gives some good ones in that chapter.
The name of his book was
The Nature of the Stratigraphical Record.
And it came out or his full name was Derek
Ager.
Ager. How's that spelled?
Yeah, Ager.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
And that was out in the early 70s.
Thank you for listening. Credible Faith is a global missions-minded apologetics ministry with content available in 7 different languages across 7 websites: German, Russian, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. If you would like to support the global apologetics work of Credible Faith, go to crediblefaith.org and click on the donate icon. If you would like me to give an apologetics workshop or participate in a debate at your university, or if you would like me to give a Great Commission missions conference or apologetics conference at your church, get in touch with me through the Contact Us section of the Credible Faith website. You can also submit a request through the website to get Credible Faith's monthly email. If you are a native speaker of Russian, German, Italian, French, Spanish, or Portuguese, and if you notice that an essay from the English website is not available on the Credible Faith website for your language, feel free to get in touch with me about translating the essay, and I would read through your translated material for quality control and the desire to see content from the essay made available in your language. Thank you for listening, and have a great night.